The Tudors were English. That was the story, written into 400 years of biography, painted into every royal portrait, stitched into the national mythology of the island itself. Elizabeth I, daughter of Henry VIII, daughter of England, the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, the woman who gave her name to an age. Then a geneticist named Tudor King drove to a car park in Leicester. She was not looking for a problem with the Tudor family tree. She was not looking for Elizabeth I at all. She was looking for a medieval king buried beneath a building that no longer existed, a king who had died on a battlefield in 1485, the same battlefield that put the first Tudor monarch on the English throne. What she found in the bone powder of a single extracted tooth would ultimately reach backward, past Bosworth Field, past the Wars of the Roses, past the English dynasties of history books had always presented as settled, and quietly complicate something that had never been seriously questioned. In a sealed archive at the College of Arms in London, there is a notation from September 7th, 1533, a baptismal record from the Chapel Royal at Greenwich Palace. It records the name of a newborn daughter, Elizabeth, child of the King of England. The document was a statement of identity, but it could not record what the blood actually carried. Hold on to a name, Ednafed Fycon. He lived in North Wales in the 12th and 13th centuries. He died in 1246. He appears in no English royal biography of the dynasty he helped create. Before this ends, you will understand why that absence matters. Stay with this. What the record shows is worth the time. The accepted story of Elizabeth I's ancestry is clean, as royal narratives are designed to be. Her father was Henry VIII, second monarch of the House of Tudor. The Tudors had come to the English throne through Henry VII, who defeated and killed Richard III at Bosworth Field in 1485. Henry VII's claim rested on two pillars: his mother, Margaret Beaufort, who descended through the legitimized Beaufort line from John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, son of Edward III, and his wife, Elizabeth of York, daughter of the Yorkist King Edward IV. By uniting the two houses in marriage, Henry VII constructed a legitimacy that was both genealogical and symbolic. The Tudor rose, red and white, two warring families resolved into a single emblem, was a visual argument made in embroidery and stone across every corner of the court. Elizabeth's mother was, in Bullen, daughter of Thomas Bullen, an English nobleman from Norfolk. Their union was itself a political earthquake, and it produced a daughter who was declared illegitimate, then restored a succession, then declared heir. Elizabeth grew up in the shadow of questions about her own right to exist as royalty. She spent the better part of her life transforming those questions into irrelevance through the sheer force of what she built. The official story, English queen of English blood, inheriting a dynasty that reached back through the Plantagenet centuries, was one she inhabited completely and projected without apparent uncertainty. This is the account as it has been told. It is not wrong, precisely, but it is incomplete. The first crack appeared not in a library, not in a genealogical archive, but in the bone powder of a tooth extracted from a skeleton found beneath a council car park in Leicester in September 2012. The skeleton had been there for 527 years. The car park had been built over the ruins of the Greyfriars Friary, the last known burial site of Richard III, the final Plantagenet king, the man killed at the battle that made the Tudors possible. When researchers at the University of Leicester published their genetic findings in the journal Nature Communications in December 2014, the main headline confirmed what most had suspected. The skeleton was Richard III, with a probability of 99.9994%. But buried inside the same paper, reported far less widely, was a second finding. The Y chromosome recovered from the skeleton did not match the living male line relatives of Richard III that the team had located and tested. The researchers were careful about what they said. They named, as an indirect consequence of the mismatch, the entire Tudor dynasty, including Elizabeth I. The crack was quiet. It was real. Dr. Tudor King was a geneticist at the University of Leicester's Department of Genetics. She had been brought to the Richard III project for her expertise in forensic ancient DNA, not because anyone suspected what the DNA would eventually imply about the royal lines that came after Richard. She was looking for confirmation of a skeleton's identity. She was not looking for a crisis of succession. That distinction matters more than it might seem. An accidental discovery cannot have an agenda. When the team analyzed mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material inherited exclusively through the maternal line, extracted from the skeleton's tooth and femur, they compared it with two living descendants of Richard's sister and Michael Ibsen, a carpenter who was Richard's nephew 16 times removed, and Wendy Duldig, an 18 times removed niece. The mitochondrial match was clean. The identification held. The skeleton in the car park was, beyond any reasonable scientific doubt, King Richard III. Then the team turned to the Y chromosome, the genetic material that passes from father to son, generation to generation, with only rare mutations. They had identified living male-line descendant of Henry Somerset, the fifth Duke of Beaufort, whose patrilineal ancestry traced back, through 19 documented generations, to Edward III, the same Plantagenet king from whom the Tudor claim also derived through the Beaufort and Lancaster lines. They compared. The Y chromosome from the skeleton did not match the living relatives. Somewhere in those 19 generations, a false paternity event had occurred. A son recorded in the official genealogy as legitimate who was not, biologically, the son of the man the record named. Here is where the steel man must be stated plainly, because it is real. This is a legitimate challenge to the weight this finding can bear. It cannot be dismissed. The DNA was clear, the methodology peer-reviewed, the results published in one of the world's most respected scientific journals. But the break could have occurred anywhere in those 19 generations. It did not necessarily occur in a generation that would compromise the Tudor claim. The research team acknowledged this directly. There are 19 links in the chain, and the probability that the break falls in a damaging position is real but unconfirmed. And yet the paper's own carefully chosen language stated plainly that the findings would also hold true, indirectly, for the entire Tudor dynasty. Those words have not been retracted. They have not been seriously contested by subsequent scholarship. They have simply been very quietly absorbed. The genetic tract produced a shadow, not a verdict. The archival tract produced something more specific, and it begins with the name promised at the start of this. Ednafed Fycon was born around 1170 in the Kingdom of Gwynedd in North Wales. He served Llywelyn the Great, Prince of Gwynedd, as seneschal, a title that combined the functions of chief minister, military commander, and administrative architect of the realm. He was not a king. He was the man who made a kingdom function. He married Gwenllian, an illegitimate daughter of Llywelyn himself, embedding his family irreversibly in the Welsh princely structure. His son served subsequent Welsh princes. After the English conquest of Wales in 1282, his descendants adapted, holding custodial and bailiff positions under the new English administration, preserving their standing while the political world transformed around them. From Ednafed's lineage came the Penmynydd family of Anglesey. Researchers at the Surname DNA Journal, cross-referencing living Welsh descendants of that family with population genetics databases, have inferred that the Tudor patrilineal Y chromosome belongs to haplogroup R1BL21, the deep genetic signature of the ancient Celtic Atlantic populations of the British Isles and Western France. Not Germanic, not Norman, not derived from the continental dynasties that dominated medieval English royalty. Welsh, specifically Old Welsh, the genetic marker of a people who had inhabited these islands long before the Normans arrived with their French titles and their continental legitimacy. Owen Tudor, in Welsh, Owain ap Merda ap Tudor, was descended from Ednafed's line through several generations. He took his grandfather's personal name as a surname, anglicizing it as the court required. He entered the household of Catherine of Valois, the widowed French queen of Henry V, their secret union. Legally precarious, possibly never formally recorded, produced Edmund Tudor, who fathered Henry VII. Henry VII's son became Henry VIII, and Henry VIII's daughter became Elizabeth I. This is where Ednafed Fycon is paid off. The patrilineal ancestry of the last Tudor monarch of England does not begin with Norman conquerors or Anglo-Saxon thanes or Plantagenet. Counts arrive from Anjou. It begins with a Welsh administrator who served a Welsh prince on an island in the Irish Sea, a man who died in 1246 before England had any conception of who the Tudors would eventually become. And there is a second independent strand. Anne Boleyn's paternal grandmother was Lady Margaret Butler, born at Kilkenny Castle in Ireland, daughter of Thomas Butler 7th Earl of Ormond. Through Margaret Butler, Elizabeth I carried the blood of the Butlers of Ormond, an Anglo-Norman family that had governed the southern Irish province of Munster for generations. The two bloodlines do not share a source. They converge, however, in the same conclusion. This is where the two tracks meet. The genetic track, rooted in the Y chromosome analysis from Richard III's skeleton, established that the Plantagenet male line had been fractured at some unknown point in the medieval period. The line, whose unbroken transmission was supposed to guarantee the dynastic legitimacy of everyone who came after Edward III. The archival track, assembled from Welsh genealogical records, the Penmynnydd family histories, the Butler-Ormond lineages of Kilkenny, and population genetics research on living Welsh surname groups, established that Elizabeth I's actual bloodline was a composite of Welsh, Irish, Norman, French Valois, and English Norman strands, and that the Plantagenet inheritance she publicly claimed ran in the critical male line through precisely the part of the genealogical tree the genetic evidence had cast into shadow. Neither research team was looking for the other's conclusion. The Leicester geneticists were identifying a skeleton. The genealogical researchers mapping the Tudor surname's roots were working in Welsh census records and Irish estate histories. Both arrived at the same gap. The English identity of the English queen was, at its foundations, a construction. The biology was older, more layered, and considerably less English than 5 centuries of official portrait had ever suggested. There is one more detail in the archival record that almost nobody has cited. We will reach it in the next section. But first, the human stakes of this deserve a moment. Elizabeth I knew she was partly Welsh. She understood the Tudor roots in Anglesey and used them deliberately. The red dragon of Cadwallader appeared in her coronation heraldry and on her own personal emblems, placed there with political calculation. She may not have known the Irish strand through Margaret Butler. She almost certainly could not have known, because no one could have known until 2014 that the specific genetic marker her dynasty used to claim Plantagenet continuity had been quietly compromised, half a millennium after the fact, by a bone powder analysis in a Leicester laboratory. She had built an entire monarchy of image: the virginal queen, the Protestant sovereign, the pure daughter of English royalty, and the image held for 450 years. The science, when it finally arrived, did not destroy that image, but it showed the image for what it always had been: a choice, a deliberate construction, a performance by a woman of Welsh and Irish and French blood of a thing called Englishness that she had partly invented in order to survive. She was not less interesting for this. She was more. The suppression was never a simple lie. It was a system, and the system had a name and a legal architecture. In the years following the Welsh rebellions of the early 15th century, English law formally restricted the rights and civic roles of Welsh-born individuals in England. Henry IV statutes, passed between 1398 and 1400, barred Welsh subjects from holding certain offices, bearing arms in English boroughs, and participating in civic governance on equal terms with English-born subjects. These laws were not abstract. Owen Tudor himself, the great-great-grandfather of Elizabeth I, the Welsh courtier whose secret union with a French queen produced the Tudor dynasty, was required to petition Parliament in 1432 for a special grant of English rights. The man whose blood would eventually sit on the English throne had to formally apply to be treated as English under the laws of the country he was about to help rule. This is the detail of the supplementary record almost no one has cited in the context of Elizabeth I's ancestry. The legal erasure of Welsh identity in the English court was not incidental. It was structural. To rule England as Tudors, the family from Penmynnydd had to become, in their public presentation, in their heraldry, in their official genealogies, English. The dragon and the coronation emblems was a permissible nod. An open reckoning with Ednafed Fycon and the kingdom of Gwynedd was not. Elizabeth I's case is not unique in its structure. It is unique only in the prominence of the name attached to it. The medieval and early modern period produced hundreds of documented cases in which royal and aristocratic lineages were sanitized, revised, or simply left unexamined to support claims of legitimate succession. Genealogists have a technical term for the events that produce the biological gaps in those lines: non-paternity events. Researchers place historical rates at between 1% and 2% per generation, a figure that, across 19 Plantagenet generations makes at least one such event statistically expected rather than remarkable. And the people who carry the actual ancestral inheritance of Elizabeth I, Welsh communities in Gwynedd and Anglesey, Butler-descended families in Kilkenny, the Valois bloodlines distributed across European aristocracy, those people are alive today. They carry a closer genetic relationship to the reality of her ancestry than most of the English nobility that surrounded her court and wrote her history. None of this diminishes what she built. Elizabeth I ruled for 45 years. She presided over a literary and intellectual flourishing that produced Shakespeare, Marlowe, Spenser, and Sidney, a generation of artists whose work shaped the English language for every century that followed. She governed a country balanced on the edge of religious civil war and held it together by a combination of political intelligence and personal myth-making that has never been fully explained. She outmaneuvered the Spanish Empire, the French court, the Scottish succession, and her own Privy Council. She gave her name to an age, and the age deserved it. Whatever the Y chromosome of a Plantagenet skeleton found in a car park reveals about the biological claims of her dynasty, none of that belongs to the question of what she did with the time she had. Her work was hers. But the question the evidence leaves behind is the one that will not close. The baptismal record from the Chapel Royal at Greenwich, the notation made in September 1533 that opened this story, the document that still rests in the archival holdings of the College of Arms, recorded her as the daughter of the King of England. It named her Elizabeth. It placed her inside the legal and ceremonial architecture of English royal identity, in ink and Latin, in an institution designed to make exactly that kind of claim permanent and unambiguous. The document did not lie, but it could not carry the full truth either. It could not note the Welsh seneschal who died in 1246 and whose patrilineal bloodline her father's father's father carried into the English court. It could not note the Irish noblewoman born at Kilkenny Castle, who was her great-great-grandmother and whose blood ran through Bullen and therefore through Elizabeth herself. It could not note the fracture in the Plantagenet Y chromosome, invisible for 500 years, until a tooth was ground to powder in a laboratory in 2014. The record said, Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of England. The science says it was more complicated than that. And what remains when the laboratory results are filed and the genealogies are closed and the papers returned to their archives is not a verdict. It is a question that every dynasty and every nation eventually faces alone. What does it mean to belong to a place? She carried the blood of people England had spent centuries trying to erase, and she used it, knowingly or not, to build the thing they called England. The dragon was always there in her coronation robes. She knew where it came from.